things are also moving along quite well in terms of how the rest of the country is viewing the business climate here in Indiana. And here to tell us about it is Kevin Brinegar with the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. Kevin, good to talk to you again.
Good to visit with you as well.
Now, Kevin, much has been made here in the region and across the state of Indiana trying to make Indiana a business-friendly state. And quite frankly, it seems to be working, especially according to a lot of the rankings. Now, some new stuff has come out. Why don't you tell us about it?
Sure. Site Selection Magazine, which is the trade magazine for professionals engaged in what is called the site selection process. They consult with companies who have new projects, new plants, or are thinking about relocating facilities to different places across the United States. It's also kind of the magazine for economic development professionals across the state, across the country. They produce an annual ranking of the overall business climate, business friendliness of different states, of the 50 states. And last week, their annual rankings came out, and Indiana was sixth highest or sixth best in the country. Now, to give your listeners some perspective, about the time Governor Daniels took office, or maybe even a little farther back, 10 years ago, our ranking was maybe around 20th or in the high teens. So we've had a lot of movement, and these are numbers that are not easy to move in terms of the rankings, because all the other states are generally trying to get better as well. And it would seem to reflect a positive view in terms of the data, the metrics that are used to make those rankings, and the analysis and the way, the perception that economic development officials around the country have about Indiana to the various public policy changes that have been made in the last 10 years. Things like eliminating the inventory tax, eliminating the corporate gross income tax, reorganizing our economic development efforts into the Economic Development Corporation, creating entities like the Regional Development Authority in Northwest Indiana, enacting telecommunications reform, high focuses on education improvement and reform, and things like that.
What about our tax situation? How does that play into this?
Well, our tax climate, and also not just our tax burdens, but our fiscal situation. Indiana ranks high for having a balanced budget, having low debt compared to other states, and the fact that we're one of the few states in the country that has a AAA bond rating for state government, believe it or not, is viewed very favorably by economic development professionals and by businesses, because it tells them that, if I locate a facility in the state, or if I grow my business in the state, I've got a better chance of not being subjected to a big tax increase than if I'm in a state like Illinois, where they've got massive budget deficits and where they just raised taxes by large amounts earlier this year.
Now we're talking to Kevin Brinegar. He is the head of the executive director of the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. He's calling from Indianapolis this morning. I know you guys are calling in and want to ask him comments and questions, but we're not going to do that right now. Maybe at some other point. Kevin, let's go to the front page of the Times here of Northwest Indiana today. He says, Governor Daniels not scared by a labor victory in the Ohio referendum. If you guys aren't following this in Ohio, the Ohio voters said no to right-to-work legislation. Some folks up here in Northwest Indiana have commented here on the air and elsewhere that perhaps Governor Mitch Daniels and some of the business interests would back off on the upcoming legislative session in trying to get right-to-work legislation pushed through. What's your position on this?
Well, first, I think a distinction needs to be made. The ballot vote in Ohio was not about right to work. It was about overturning legislation that had passed earlier in their General Assembly to restrict collective bargaining rights for state employees.
It was the public unions in Ohio.
And
okay.
They're right. So it was not a right to work question at all. But I've already heard some folks trying to make an analogy to that. One, we don't have in our Constitution anything that allows the public to gather signatures and put an initiative on the ballot to overturn any law. And so that was a whole different animal than the issue of whether or not Indiana should or would adopt right-to-work legislation. We have a long-standing, our organization, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, has a long-standing position supporting right-to-work. Indiana used to be a right-to-work state years ago. And the listeners need to understand, probably first and foremost, that what that term means. It means that the state would enact legislation that would prohibit collective bargaining agreements in the private sector that force new employees to pay, to join and pay into the union. Right to work gives employees the choice of association and to decide whether they want to join that organization or not.